Hello everybody, chapter 6 is going to cover anatomy and physiology. So the first thing we're going to go over is body system. First is musculoskeletal system. Three main functions of this system gives the body its shape. So this is your whole skeletal system, muscles, everything makes you the size and the shape that you are. Next, it protects the vital internal organs. Your rib cage protects all those big solid organs. Your other bones protect your other main vessels. Your skull protects your brain. Numerous aspects with that. Also provides for body movement with all your muscles, your tendons, your ligaments, all of those components. So the skeletal component consists of your skull, spine, ribs, sternum, shoulders, upper extremities, pelvis, lower extremities. All the bones in your body are all part of the skeletal system. So with the skull, I'm pretty sure everybody's aware that the purpose of the skull is to protect your brain. That's a pretty important component of your body. So that skull is a big, thick part of bone to protect that ever vital brain. So the cranium is the top, back, and sides of your skull, with the face of it being the front of the skull. Your face is where the face of the skull is. The skull connects to the facial bones. You've got your mandible, which is your jawbone, the part that moves up and down when you talk. Your maxilla, which is the upper part, like where your mustache would be. Your nasal bones, your nose, your orbits, the part, your eye socket essentially, and the zygomatic arches, those nice big cheeks of yours. So as you see in the skull is comprised of a little bit of components. So seeing these little sutures in here, and guess why those are there? Yes, whenever you were a baby, these weren't quite solid. So as you got older, you got a solid head. So when those little babies come out with those cone heads, that's why their skull is a little bit flexible. So the parts of the skull, the parietal bone, this major just top part of your skull, the temporal part in your temporal region. Occipital is the back part of the skull. Frontal bone, pretty self-explanatory, in the front. Then you see here again your zygomatic bone of your zygomatic arch of your cheek. Mandible, the part that goes up and down. Maxilla, where your mustache would be. Orbits of the eyes. Nasal bones, and the lacrimal bone, which is deep inside, and that's basically the hole where your tear duct is. And your spinal column consists of 33 vertebrae. That's essential for your movement, sensation, and all your vital functions. In that spinal column maintains your spinal cord. So the thorax part of the spinal column consists of where the heart, lungs, and major blood vessels are. That thorax, your whole rib cage, your thoracic cavity, is what protects all those big, really important organs of the heart, lungs, and other major blood vessels. So you see in that spinal column of the 33 vertebrae, the two most important ones, the C1 and C2, the atlas and the axis. Notice C1 and 2, atlas, axis. Remember those terms and just know from C1 to C2, atlas and axis, that's in alphabetical order. Next, within those is a cervical vertebrae. That's the first 7 vertebrae in your neck. So we talk about C-spine, that's your cervical spine. So C1 and 2 are all comprised in those cervical vertebrae. So 1 through 7. Next is your thoracic vertebrae, that thoracic cavity of your ribs, protecting your heart and your lungs and major blood vessels. There are 12 of those. Your lumbar, your lower back, 5 of those. And then your sacrum, that's the back part of your pelvis, and your coccyx, that's your tailbone. So notice in order here, 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, and 5 lumbar. So an easy way to remember that, we eat breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, dinner at 5. Next component of the musculoskeletal system is the pelvis. Pelvis, big bony part that a lot of old folks just tend to break when they fall down and go boom. So in your pelvis is the ilium. That is actually the bony part of your hips that you can feel sticking out, those arches of your hip. Next is the ischium, kind of down here around where your bony butt would be. That's you're feeling your ischium. And your pubis is more in the middle line there of the pubic region. And then lastly is the hip joint, the acetabulum. That's where the ball of your femur attaches into there. With the lower extremities, you have first the femur, the big bone where your thigh is. The femur is the biggest bone in the body. Next, the patella. The patella is your kneecap. Then your tibia, that's your shin. The tibia is the bone that you can feel. The fibula is the lateral bone, so lateral meaning towards the outside. And then within the ankle, you have the lateral malleolus, which is the outside part of your ankle bone, and the medial towards the middle malleolus is the end part of the ankle you can feel. With your foot, you have metatarsals, which are basically the long parts of your foot, and then the phalanges. Your phalanges are actually your toes, and then the calcaneus being your heel. And you see here where the tibia and fibula connect in. Upper extremities, you have a clavicle. Clavicle is your collarbone. Scapula. Scapula is your shoulder blade. Humerus is the upper part of your bone, which connects into the funny bone, which is not so humorous. Haha, get it? And then your radius and your ulna. The radius is on the thumb side of your hand in that anatomical position. So radius by your thumb, whenever you move your arm in a circle, you make a radius. Ulna is on that inside. And then your carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. So those carpals, carpal tunnel is in your wrist. Metacarpals, the bony parts of the back side of your hand, and then the phalanges being your fingers. And again, wrist is the carpals, hand contains the metacarpals, and those phalanges are your finger bones. There are numerous joints in your body, but there's basically only two types of joints. You have a ball and socket joint, which is just like your hip and your shoulder, and you have the hinge joints, like your elbow and your knee. So in these joints, everything that holds all together is those tendons bind the muscle to the bone, whereas the ligaments connect the bone to the bone. And with that, in the muscles, there are three kinds of muscles. There are voluntary muscles, there's the skeletal muscles. So those are the kind of muscles you can work out and make bigger. You know, the curls for the girls kind of thing. You have the involuntary muscles, which are smooth muscles. Those are the muscles you don't have any control over, such as the stomach muscles and intestines and things like that. Then you have your cardiac muscles, which is just only found in the heart. So those are the little muscles that kind of conduct their own electrical impulses. So the cardiac circuit does its own little thing, and that's the only place you can find those cardiac muscles. So here's this little bit of an illustration of the three different types of muscles, whereas those skeletal muscles are a little bit bigger of strand as you can make them get bigger, whereas the cardiac muscles are small interwoven muscles, and the smooth muscle a little bit smoother and a little bit more fine. Now we'll move on to the respiratory system. So everybody's probably pretty familiar with how it all works. So air, oxygen, enters the body through the mouth and the nose. As it goes through the oropharynx and the nasopharynx, meaning in through your nose and your mouth, which is combined of the whole pharynx, the air moves towards the lungs. The epiglottis is that little flap that's in your throat when you get that little tickle or when you have a feeling of something went down the wrong hole. Well, that's what that epiglottis is for. It goes over the flap to keep you from, chugging your root beer or whatever you're going to drink or eat. Prevents that from going into your lungs. So your larynx is comprised of the voice box and your vocal cords. There's also a major cricoid cartilage, which forms the lower portion of that, so that kind of bony feeling you feel in your neck. Then your trachea and your lungs, which branch on out into the bronchi, and then the bronchi branch on out into the alveoli. And your diaphragm is that final part of what draws the air into your lungs. When the diaphragm moves down, air comes in. As it relaxes and pushes up, it pushes air out. So as you see here is the pharynx. You got your nasal cavity, your nasopharynx, your oral cavity, your oropharynx, and then everything goes into your larynx, where your vocal cords are located at. So if you feel in your neck, the hard surface midline of your neck is the larynx. From the larynx, air moves down into the trachea. So this trachea is pretty hard and rigid. It's kind of like a vacuum cleaner hose. It's got a lot of rigid rings around it that makes it really strong, prevents it from pinching and collapsing when you move your neck around. Just think of that vacuum cleaner hose, how hard it is to kind of kink at because of those spiral rings around it. So then it goes down into your bronchi. You got your main stem bronchi going to the left side and your right stem bronchi going to the right side. And then down here is your diaphragm. It rests right at the base of your lungs, so as it moves down, it pulls air into the body. And as it relaxes, it pushes the air back out of the body. With inhalation, that is an active process. So that diaphragm's pulling down, those intercostal muscles, those muscles in between your ribs, they contract and they pull your ribs apart. So it makes your thoracic cavity get much bigger, allowing for your lungs to inflate with the air being pulled in. So that negative pressure pulls air into the lungs, inhaling the oxygen. Exhalation is a passive process. So that diaphragm and your intercostal muscles, those rib muscles, they're relaxing. That thoracic space is getting smaller. That diaphragm's relaxing, and the air is going back outside due to the positive pressure. And then as you exhale carbon dioxide, CO2. So with the movement of oxygen coming in and carbon dioxide going out, ventilation is known as the movement of gases to and from the alveoli. So an alveoli is where gas exchange is happening. And respiration is the exchange of those gases between the cells in the bloodstream. So ventilation gets that air into the lungs down to the alveoli, and respiration is that gas exchange is happening at the blood cells. So basically, as oxygen comes in, the blood cells that are going through those alveoli, oxygen hops onto those blood cells, and then CO2 comes off of those blood cells, and then you exhale that out. So at that alveolar level, it's kind of like a boat coming through a barge. That oxygen comes down in, goes at alveoli, the bloodstream the circulates around its alveoli, that cells like the boat. So the oxygen comes in, hops on the boat, and then the boat dumps off its old load, which was CO2. So at that cellular level is where all that gas exchange happens. And the carbon dioxide is a waste product from metabolism happening in the body. That's the byproduct of energy. So think about CO2 kind of like the exhaust on your car. So all the horsepower is being created in that motor, and that gas that comes out your exhaust is kind of like CO2. Where instead of, where we think about gas coming out of our exhaust, that's a little bit different. So our byproduct waste comes out our mouth of CO2. The other exhaust, that's just methane. So all that blood goes circulating around, and then it just repeats the process. So up next, you'll see a little bit of a more informative video of that whole process.
The respiratory system moves air through the nose, pharynx, larynx, trachea, and bronchus to the alveoli, where the gas exchange between oxygen and carbon dioxide occurs. Nares are the openings to the nose. The nasal cavity is lined with cilia, mucous membranes, and blood capillaries. The air is filtered by cilia, moistened by mucous membranes, and warmed by the blood. Air moves into the pharynx or throat, the common passageway for food and air. Air continues on to the larynx. The epiglottis, a flap of tissue in front of the larynx, closes off the larynx when swallowing to prevent food from entering. The larynx or voice box contains the vocal folds. The trachea or windpipe connects the larynx to the bronchial tree. The cartilage rings of the trachea prevent the trachea from collapsing. Lungs are spongy tissue with alveoli and blood capillaries. Breathing occurs because of the expansion and contraction of the lungs. The bronchi carrying the air subdivide into smaller branches called bronchioles. At the end of each bronchiole are the alveolar sacs. The alveolar sacs are surrounded by blood capillaries and contain millions of single-layer alveoli cells where the gas exchange takes place. Oxygenated air goes from the nose to the pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchus, and alveoli. By the process of diffusion, oxygen in the air moves from the alveoli to the capillaries. Carbon dioxide moves from the capillaries to the alveoli and is exhaled. This process is called respiration.
A big thing to know about physiology of the airway is the difference between adults and children. So you'll see in this picture here, as a child, as they're laying down, you see this trachea is kind of bent. And you notice the drawing of the tongue here compared to the tongue of adults? Yes, the tongue of a child is much larger in proportion to their mouth than the adult. So as everybody lays on their back, that tongue will rest on the back of the airway and can compromise that airway. So unconscious patients, things like that, we have to worry about that tongue laying on the back of the airway. Same thing with kids. So we go and position those heads to get that tongue freed up off the airway. Something very, very important to remember is the tongue is the #1 obstruction of the airway. The tongue, this big old floppy tongue, is the #1 obstruction of the airway.